publicly brutalized for defying a forced marriage. A resilient woman finds an unlikely savior in a stoic Lakota warrior. In the unforgiving wilderness, their shared battle for survival blossoms into a wild, passionate love that will forever change a town built on fear. The sun is a merciless hammer in a bleached white sky. In the center of the dusty square stands Eliza Vance, 20s, her wrists bound tight to a livestock hitching post. Her simple cotton blouse is already ribboned with blood, clinging to her back from the first lash of the whip. Her dark braid, once a source of pride, is now a dusty rope against her neck. The townsfolk of Hollow Rock gather in a silent, hungry circle. They are not here to intervene, but to witness, to learn. Eliza refused Silas Pike, the valley's richest, cruelest man. Her refusal was not a whispered plea, but a public declaration, a firebrand tossed into the dry tinder of patriarchal pride. Sheriff Brody, his face a mask of weary reluctance, holds the whip. "Sheriff Brody!" loud for the crowd. "This is the price of defiance." He avoids her eyes. The whip cracks again, a sound like lightning splitting a dead tree. Eliza bites her lip, the coppery taste of her own blood a shocking, grounding reality. From the edge of the crowd, Coda, 30s, a Lakota man whose presence is as natural and unsettling as a hawk's shadow, watches. His face is stoic, but his eyes dark and intense. Miss nothing. They memorize the curve of her spine, the clench of her jaw, the untamed fire that the whip cannot extinguish. Part 1. The Flight and the Finding. The third lash was a hot, tearing claw. Eliza's knees buckled, her body sagging against the rough wood of the post. A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a flicker of pity, perhaps, or just the shifting of uncomfortable feet. Her father, Jedediah Vance, stood near Pike's mercantile, his face turned away, a statue of shame and complicity. He had traded her for the promise of fertile land, a bargain that had soured in the public square. "That's enough, Brody," a woman's voice, thin and reedy, called out from the back. But Silas Pike, a monolith of smug satisfaction standing on the mercantile porch, gave a subtle, sharp nod. The town's elders echoed his sentiment with their silence. The sentence was 7 lashes, one for each day she had held her no against her father's yes. The 4th lash struck. A scream tore from her, but she swallowed it, turning it into a guttural gasp. Her vision swam in a haze of red-tinged pain. Through that shimmering curtain of agony, her eyes locked onto the figure at the edge of the square. Coda. He hadn't moved, his arms crossed over his broad chest. But as the 5th lash fell, he turned. He didn't walk. He flowed away, melting back into the alley between the smithy and the saloon, disappearing as quietly as he had appeared. No one saw his hands clench into fists, the knuckles white. No one but Eliza, who, through a sliver of clarity in her torment, saw him leave. And in that moment, a bizarre and inexplicable pang of abandonment shot through her, sharper than the whip itself. He had seen her humiliation, and he had turned away. The 7th lash left her hanging by her bound wrists, her body a dead weight of pain. The sheriff cut her down. She fell to the dirt in a heap. Her father approached, his shadow falling over her. "You brought this on yourself," he muttered, his voice gravelly with resentment, and walked away. That was the true, final cut. Not the whip, but his words. The home she had known was ash. The family she had belonged to was a ghost. As night fell, a deeper darkness crept into Hollow Rock. Eliza, fueled by a primal instinct she didn't know she possessed, dragged herself to her feet. Every muscle screamed. Her back was a raw, burning landscape of agony. Under the cloak of a moonless sky, she staggered out of town, her bare feet finding the coolest patches of dirt on the road. The forest loomed ahead, a black, whispering maw. She had no plan, no food, no water, no shoes. She only had the searing memory of her father's back, and the wild, desperate need to be anywhere else. The wilderness was not a gentle refuge. It was a place of teeth and shadows. Coyotes yipped and howled, their calls echoing in the canyons. The wind whispered through the pines. sounding like the disapproving voices of the town. Her flight was a fever dream. The pain in her back was a living fire, and her strength was a rapidly draining reservoir. After what felt like an eternity, her legs gave out. She collapsed near a sheer rock face, crawling into a shallow hollow beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient juniper tree. Pressing her burning face against the cool, damp earth, she wept. Not for her father, not for the town, but for the girl who had been tied to that post. She let that girl die in the dirt. She drifted in and out of consciousness. Time lost its meaning. Was it hours? A day? She dreamt of a strong hand reaching for her, not to strike, but to lift. She dreamt of the crackle of a fire, of the scent of pine and sage. When she woke, it wasn't a dream. A small, well-tended fire crackled a few feet away, casting a warm, dancing glow against the rock face. The air smelled of wood smoke and brewing herbs. She tried to turn her head, and a gasp of pain escaped her lips. A figure moved from the shadows into the firelight. It was him. Coda. Dot. He was sitting cross-legged, stirring a small pot that hung over the flames. He didn't look at her, yet she felt the weight of his awareness. His presence filled the small hollow, a solid, calming force against the chaos of her pain. "The world thought you were dead," he said. His voice was a low rumble, the sound of stones shifting at the bottom of a river. "But you are not." The sound of it, the simple, factual statement, was the most profound kindness she had ever known. Eliza tried to push herself up, to reclaim some shred of dignity, but a blinding surge of pain shot through her back, and she cried out, a raw, wounded sound. In a single fluid motion, he was beside her. He held a damp cloth, cool and smelling of the forest itself. "Lie still," he commanded, but his voice was gentle. He eased her back down onto the bed of soft pine needles he had prepared. "The wounds are deep. They were meant to break you." Tears pricked her eyes, hot with confusion and a shame she couldn't name. "Why?" she rasped, her throat raw. "Why did you help me?" He finally met her gaze. His eyes were dark pools, and in their depths, she saw no pity. Pity was for the weak, for the defeated. What she saw was recognition, a startling, profound acknowledgement of her spirit. "Because you did not scream for them," he said simply. "You bled, but you did not beg. They scarred your skin, but your fire they could not touch." He reached out, not to her wounds, but to a stray lock of hair that had fallen across her cheek, and tucked it gently behind her ear. The brief touch was electric, a spark in the cold, dark night. It wasn't the touch of a savior to a victim. It was the touch of one wild thing to another. A current of heat, fierce and untamed, flowed between them. A silent language of shared defiance. He saw the fight in her, and something in him, something just as wild, answered it. Part 2. The Fire Within and the Name. Eliza looked away, her heart hammering against her ribs. The intensity in his gaze was too much, a fire that threatened to consume what little composure she had left. He had seen the most violated, humiliated version of herself, yet he looked at her as if she were a queen. This silent, formidable man had not only saved her body, but was now tending to the embers of her soul. And in his presence, she felt a strange, dangerous mix of gratitude and a burgeoning, wild attraction. He returned to the fire, the silence stretching between them again. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was charged, filled with unspoken things. It held not judgment, but a shared space. It whispered, "You are not alone." The next days were a blur of pain, healing, and learning. Coda was a master of the wilderness. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing to watch. He treated her back with a poultice of chewed herbs and mud that cooled the burning and drew out the infection. He fed her a thin, nourishing broth made from roots and rabbit, which he'd caught with a silent, swift arrow. He never asked about Hollow Rock, about Pike, about her father. He didn't need to. He had been a witness. Instead, he taught her, not with words, but with actions. He showed her which berries were safe, how to find north by the moss on the trees, how to listen to the language of the forest. She was a clumsy student at first, her body stiff and sore, her mind clouded by trauma. But she was also a desperate one. "Why were you in town?" she asked one evening, her voice stronger now. She was propped against the rock wall. A warm deer-hide coat had given her draped over her shoulders. The question had been burning in her mind. He was sharpening a knife, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel the only sound. "I trade furs," he said without looking up. "Sometimes." It wasn't a full answer, but she knew it was all she would get. A few days later, a new scent drifted on the wind. Smoke. But it wasn't the fragrant smoke of their own campfire. It was the acrid, greasy smell of a structure burning. Coda was already on his feet, his body tense, sniffing the air like a wolf. He moved to the edge of the ridge they were camped upon. Eliza followed, her heart a cold stone in her chest. In the distance, a column of black smoke rose into the blue sky. It was from the direction of her old home, her father's cabin. "They're erasing me," she whispered. The words were hollow, devoid of tears. She had no tears left for that place. All the pain had been scoured out, leaving only a strange, hard emptiness. Coda returned to her side. His face was a thundercloud. "It is what cowards do," he said, his voice a low growl. "They burn what they cannot control. They fear what they cannot own." Eliza sank to the ground, the deer hide pooling around her. "I wasn't theirs to own. Not in the beginning, not ever." "They believed you were," Coda said, kneeling in front of her. His proximity was overwhelming, a field of heat and quiet power. "Now you are no one. No name, no home." His words should have been devastating, but strangely, they felt like a liberation. "Yes," she breathed. "No one." He reached into a small leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a piece of hide. He unrolled it carefully. Inside lay a pendant, carved from the dark wood of an ironwood tree. It was a spiral, etched with fine, intricate lines that seemed to move in the firelight. "What is it?" she asked, her voice hushed. "A name," he said, holding it out to her. "The one I would give you, if you choose to take it." She hesitated, then took it. The wood was smooth and warm against her palm. She traced the carved spiral with her fingertip. It felt ancient, powerful. "What does it mean?" His eyes locked with hers, and the firelight danced in their dark depths. "It is not a word, but an idea. One who walks through fire and is not burned. One who becomes the fire." The breath left her body in a rush. To be seen not as broken, not as a victim, but as forged. It shattered the last remnants of her old self. This man didn't just see her survival. He saw her transformation. He saw her power. "You don't know me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I know what matters," he replied, his voice soft but resolute. "I saw them try to put out your light. I saw that they failed." A single tear, hot and cleansing, traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He reached out and caught the tear with his thumb, his touch both rough and gentle. His hand lingered on her cheek, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch all over her body. The air crackled. The space between them shrank until it was nothing. This was more than comfort, more than protection. This was a magnetic, primal pull, the recognition of two souls who had found their counterpart in the wild. He leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from hers. The world stopped. There was only the fire, the scent of pine, and the wild, unspoken promise in his eyes. He was offering her not just a new name, but a new world, a new life, a new self, forged in the heat of their shared defiance. Part 3. The Hunt and the Promise. The moment was a precipice. The air was thick with unspoken desire, a wild, dangerous energy that had been building since he first laid eyes on her. Eliza's breath hitched. She could feel the heat radiating from him, see the fire in his eyes that mirrored the one he'd just named in her. She wanted him to close the distance, to seal the promise of this new world with a kiss that would burn away the last of her old life. But then, a twig snapped in the darkness beyond their fire. Instantly, Koda pulled back. The passion in his eyes was replaced by the sharp, lethal focus of a predator. He was on his feet in a silent flash, a bow in his hand as if it had materialized from the shadows. He motioned for her to get down, to move behind the rocks. "Stay," he whispered, the single word a steel command. Eliza obeyed, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The spell was broken, but the electricity of it still hummed in her veins. She scrambled behind a cluster of granite boulders, peering through a crack. 3 riders emerged from the trees, their figures stark silhouettes against the starlit sky. Even from a distance, she recognized the hulking shapes of Silas Pike's hired men, the same men who had held her arms, whose jeers had been part of the chorus of her humiliation. They rode with a grim purpose, their rifles held ready. They were hunting. They were hunting her. One of them, a man with a scarred face she remembered all too well, dismounted. He knelt, examining the ground near where their old fire had been. "Fresh tracks," he grunted, his voice carrying in the still night air. The savage and the girl, they went this way. The leader, a cruel-faced man named Cletus, grinned, a flash of white in the gloom. "Pike wants her back, alive if possible. Broken is fine. Let's find them. That Lakota bastard can't hide forever." A cold dread washed over Eliza. They would not stop. Pike was a man who could not tolerate being defied. She was a loose thread, and he meant to pull it until she unraveled completely. Koda moved like a ghost, circling around the far side of their camp, melting into the deeper shadows of the forest. He returned a moment later, pressing a small, sharp skinning knife into her hand. The cold steel was a grim comfort. "They will find this camp," he said, his voice a low whisper directly in her ear. His breath was warm against her skin, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. "I will lead them away. I will make a new trail for them to follow." "Alone?" she breathed, the thought of him facing those 3 men sending a spike of panic through her. It was a new and terrifying feeling. She had feared for her own life, but this fear for his was sharper, more profound. "It is my way," he said. He looked down at the knife in her hand, then met her eyes. His gaze was fierce, possessive. "This is not for them. It is for you. Your life, your death. It belongs only to you now. Do you understand?" She stared at him, at the hard line of his jaw, the absolute conviction in his eyes. He wasn't just giving her a weapon. He was giving her back her agency, the one thing Pike and the whole town had tried to strip from her. Something inside her shifted, hardened from a desperate ember into a hot, defiant coal. "I'm not dying for them," she said, her voice a low, vicious promise. "And neither are you." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, perhaps something more, crossed his face. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then stay silent, stay hidden, and wait for my signal." Before she could say another word, he was gone, a shadow detaching from other shadows. She heard him a minute later, a deliberate sound, a snapping branch to the north of the camp. Immediately, the riders' heads jerked in that direction. "There!" Cletus yelled. "After him!" Thunder of their hooves faded into the distance as they gave chase. Eliza was left alone in the ringing silence, the knife clutched in her hand, her heart a wild drum. She pressed herself against the cold stone, every fiber of her being focused on the darkness where Koda had disappeared. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a keeper of the flame, waiting for the warrior who had recognized its light. The night was long, and for the first time, she prayed. Not for her own safety, but for his. The wild love that had almost bloomed by the fire was now a fierce, protective instinct, an anchor in the terrifying darkness. She would wait, and she would be ready. Part 4. Whispers and Warriors. The forest held its breath. Eliza remained pressed against the granite, motionless for hours, as the moon traced its slow arc across the sky. The knife in her hand felt like an extension of her own will. The fear for Koda was a constant, sharp ache in her chest, a feeling so potent it overshadowed her own physical pain. She strained her ears, listening for any sound, a gunshot, a shout, the return of hoofbeats, but there was only the whisper of the wind and the frantic thrumming of her own blood. She thought of him moving through the darkness, a phantom of the forest, his knowledge of the land his greatest weapon. He was drawing them away, leading them on a fool's errand through treacherous terrain. But they were three, and they were armed with rifles. The thought was a physical blow, and she gripped the knife tighter. She refused to imagine him falling. Instead, she focused on his strength, his silence, his utter competence. She held onto the image of his eyes, the fire in them, the promise. Just as the first hint of gray lightened the eastern sky, she saw it. A flicker of orange, far to the south, on a distant ridge. Then another, and another. A fire, a signal. Relief washed over her, so powerful it made her weak. He was alive. He was communicating with her. Her instinct screamed at her to stay put, to obey his command. But a stronger, more primal urge took over. The same instinct that had driven her from Hollow Rock now drove her towards him. She was not a passive victim waiting for rescue. She was his partner in this fight. She moved, not with the panic stumbling of her initial escape, but with a new, calculated grace. She stayed low, using the trees and rocks for cover, her bare feet learning to read the texture of the ground, to step without snapping a twig. Her back protested with sharp jolts of pain, but she pushed it to the back of her mind. The fear for him had burned it away. She reached the edge of the clearing where the signal fire now burned low. The scene that met her eyes made her freeze. Two of Pike's men were on the ground. One was bound and gagged, glaring at her with hateful eyes. The other lay unnaturally still, a dark stain spreading across his chest. Cletus, the leader, was gone, and there was Coda. He was crouched by the fire, cleaning blood from a long, wicked-looking knife. His own. 9 steps. There was a shallow gash on his forearm, and his face was grim, but he was whole. He was magnificent. He looked up as she approached, his eyes immediately finding hers. There was no surprise, only a quiet acknowledgement, as if he had known she would come. "Are you hurt?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He shook his head, gesturing to his arm. A scratch. They were clumsy. He looked at the dead man. This one was not. The third one, the leader, he ran when his friend fell. He is on his way back to Pike. Eliza stared at the body, a wave of nausea rolling through her. She had seen brutality, but this was the cold, hard finality of death. You could have killed them all. Death is an ending, Coda said, his voice flat. He rose and came to her, wiping his blade clean on a handful of leaves. Fear is a message. The one who ran will carry our message back to Hollow Rock. He will tell Pike that the ghosts of the forest have teeth. He looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her, seeing the knife still clutched in her hand, the new hardness in her eyes. He will tell him that you are not a broken girl to be hunted. A profound shift occurred between them in that moment. He hadn't just protected her. He had created an opening for her to reclaim her own power. He had made them fear her. "They will come again," she said. "Let them," Coda replied. He reached out and gently took the skinning knife from her hand, replacing it in the sheath at her belt. His fingers brushed against hers, and the spark was there again, fierce and undeniable. "Next time, you will not be hiding behind the rocks. You will stand beside me." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, a vow. And as she looked into his unwavering eyes, she knew, with every fiber of her being, that she could, that she would. That night, they moved their camp deeper into the mountains. As they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence enveloped them. The near violence had forged a new level of intimacy between them. "You have lost someone," she said softly. Not a question, but a statement. She saw it in the depths of his eyes sometimes, a shadow of an old pain. He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "My sister," he said finally, his voice rough. "When I was a boy, she was taken, by men like Pike. I never saw her again. I searched until my spirit was worn thin. The confession hung in the air, raw and vulnerable. Without thinking, Eliza reached out, her hand covering his. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple gesture of shared grief and understanding. He didn't pull away. His hand turned under hers, his fingers lacing with hers. The contact was electric, a current of shared strength and sorrow. "I am sorry," she whispered. He looked at their joined hands, then at her face, his expression unreadable. "I could not save her," he said, "but I will not let them take you." The promise was a brand on her heart. This was the fierce, wild love of the wilderness, not of sweet words and gentle caresses, but of shared battles, of silent vows, of a bond forged in fire and blood. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and for the first time since she was a little girl, she felt completely, utterly safe. Not because he was strong, but because their strength was now one. Part 5. The Return and the Reckoning. The days that followed were a metamorphosis. The wilderness, guided by Koda's quiet tutelage, reshaped Eliza. The softness of her old life was stripped away, replaced by a lean, resilient strength. She learned to track, to hunt with a small bow he made for her, to read the clouds, to make her own remedies from bark and leaf. Her hands, once soft, became calloused and capable. The scars on her back, once a map of her shame, became a testament to her survival. Her love for Koda deepened with every shared sunrise, every silent meal, every lesson learned. It was a love that didn't need words. It was in the way he watched her, his eyes filled with a fierce pride. It was in the way she anticipated his needs, leaving a flask of fresh water where he would find it after a long hunt. It was in the long nights they spent by the fire, their shoulders brushing, the space between them humming with a powerful, untamed passion that was waiting for its moment. The decision to return was not born of anger, but of clarity. It came to her one morning as she was successfully stretching a rabbit pelt on a frame, her own hands doing the work that had once been a mystery. She was no longer the girl who had fled Hollow Rock. She was the woman Koda had named, the woman who walked through fire. "I'm going back," she announced, her voice clear and steady. Koda was carving a new arrow. He didn't look up, but his hand stilled. He had been waiting for this. He knew she could not be truly free until she faced the ghosts she had left behind. "Then I walk with you," he said simply. "This is not for a fight," she clarified, though her heart hammered at the thought. "It is to be seen." "I know," he said, finally meeting her gaze. A slow, rare smile touched his lips. "It is time they saw who you have become." They walked out of the forest 2 days later, not as a fugitive and her rescuer, but as two warriors. Eliza wore clothes made of soft deerskin she had treated herself. The ironwood pendant Koda had carved for her lay against her chest. Koda walked at her side, his stride easy and confident, his presence a silent, formidable shield. Hollow Rock was unchanged. The same crooked signs, the same whispering porch sitters, the same dust. But the moment they stepped into the main square, a hush fell over the town. A baker, halfway to his oven with a tray of dough, froze. A woman gasped and pulled her child behind her skirts. Sheriff Brody, coming out of his office, stopped dead, his face draining of color. Eliza's eyes swept over them all, cold and unflinching. She saw fear. She saw awe. She saw the reflection of her own power. She walked with a purpose that parted the gawkers like a ship's prow through water. Her destination was not the mercantile or her father's burned-out cabin. It was the public well, the very center of the square where the hitching post still stood, its wood stained dark with her own blood. Silas Pike was standing on his porch, a look of stunned disbelief on his face. He had sent 3 men to dispose of her. One had returned, babbling of ghosts and a demon woman. He had dismissed it as cowardice. Now the ghost stood before him, more real and more terrifying than he could have imagined. Eliza walked straight to the hitching post. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away from it. She reached out and laid a hand on the rough, stained wood. The crowd held its collective breath. "This post," she said, her voice ringing out in the unnatural silence, clear and strong as a bell. "You all saw me tied to this post. You saw me whipped for saying no. You watched, and you said nothing." She turned her gaze from the post to the faces in the crowd, meeting their eyes one by one. "You thought you were witnessing a lesson. You thought you were seeing a woman broken." She straightened to her full height, her chin lifted. Coda stood a few feet behind her, his arms crossed, a silent mountain at her back. "Look at me now," she commanded. "I am not broken. I was not a lesson. I was a warning. A warning that you cannot own a soul that refuses to be bought. You cannot whip a spirit that refuses to kneel." She then turned her gaze directly on Silas Pike. The hatred in his eyes was palpable, but it was laced with a new emotion: fear. "Your power," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "is built on the silence of others. But I am no longer silent." With that, she turned her back on the post, on Pike, on the entire stunned town, and walked away. Coda fell into step beside her. They didn't run. They walked, their heads held high, back towards the freedom of the wilderness. They had not come for revenge. They had come for her reclamation. And as they left the town shrouded in a stunned, fearful silence, Eliza knew she had not just been seen. She had been heard. The reckoning had begun. Part 6. The River and the Rising. The confrontation in the square was a stone dropped into a stagnant pond, and the ripples were deadly. Silas Pike was a man unaccustomed to public humiliation. Eliza's defiance had not just challenged his authority, it had mocked it. He would not stand for it. He gathered his remaining men, his face a mask of cold fury. This would end now. Eliza and Coda knew the response would be swift and violent. They didn't retreat deep into the mountains this time. They made their stand near a sharp bend in the river, a place of rushing water and high, rocky banks. It was a place Coda chose, a place where the terrain itself was a weapon. They came at dawn, 6 of them, moving with less caution now, fueled by Pike's rage and the promise of a hefty reward. They found Eliza by the river's edge, seemingly alone, gathering medicinal herbs. It was a deliberate trap. The first man, eager for glory, charged out of the tree line. "There she is!" he roared. Eliza didn't freeze. She dropped her basket and pivoted, the long, sharp knife Coda had given her already in her hand. Her stance was low and balanced, just as he had taught her. The man lunged, and she moved like water, sidestepping his clumsy attack. Her blade darted out, slicing across the back of his thigh. He howled and crumpled to the ground. 2 more burst from the trees, trying to flank her. An arrow hissed from the rocks above, striking one man in the shoulder, spinning him around with a cry of agony. "Coda!" He moved along the ridge, a phantom raining silent death, his bow an extension of his will. Eliza faced the second man, her eyes blazing. He hesitated, his confidence shattered by the sudden, coordinated attack. That hesitation was his undoing. She lunged forward, not with the brute force of a man, but with speed and precision, driving the butt of her knife into his throat. He staggered back, gagging, his hands flying to his neck. The battle was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Coda's arrows found their marks, disabling, not always killing, sowing panic among Pike's men. Eliza moved with a deadly grace on the ground, a dancer in a lethal ballet. She was no longer just surviving, she was fighting. She was protecting her home, her life, her love. Finally, only one man was left standing, his face pale with terror. He dropped his rifle and bolted, scrambling back into the woods. Silence fell, broken only by the rush of the river and the groans of the wounded. Eliza stood in the center of the clearing, her chest heaving, not from fear, but from the exhilarating, terrifying rush of battle. Blood, not her own, was on her hands. Coda descended from the rocks, his face grim, but his eyes shining with a fierce, burning pride. He walked to her, ignoring the wounded men on the ground. He stood before her, his gaze sweeping over her, from the determined set of her jaw to the blood on her blade. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The world narrowed to the space between them. The battle, the blood, the wounded men. It all faded away. There was only the raw, powerful connection that arced between them. "You are the fire," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "We are," she corrected, her voice soft. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tender kiss. It was a clash of lightning and thunder, a kiss of wildness and fire, of survival and victory. It was the culmination of every shared silence, every unspoken promise, every moment of defiance. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, a love forged not in the parlors of civilization, but in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. It tasted of wood smoke, of blood, of the river, and of a freedom so profound it was dizzying. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. They stood in the aftermath of their battle, two souls bound together by a love that was as untamed and powerful as the land itself. They had faced down the demons of their past and had not just won, they had risen. Together. Years passed. The story of the whipped girl who returned from the dead became a legend in Hollow Rock, a cautionary tale whispered by firelight. They called her the Ghost of the River. Silas Pike's power crumbled, his cruelty finally turning the tide of public opinion against him, and he left town in disgrace. But Eliza and Coda were no ghosts. On a high meadow overlooking the river, they built a life. A small, sturdy cabin made with their own hands. A home. We see them now, years later, their faces etched with the lines of a life lived fully and freely. They stand on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple. Eliza leans against Coda, his arm wrapped securely around her. The ironwood pendant, dark and smooth with age, is still around her neck. Her story was no longer one of pain, but a map for others who felt trapped. It taught that true strength isn't the absence of scars, but the courage to wear them with pride. It's a testament that some spirits, like the wild land they inhabit, can never truly be tamed. Her legend was a reminder that even in the harshest of places, love can bloom, wild and fierce, and that a single defiant soul can change everything. The tales of the West are written in dust and blood, but the most powerful ones are written on the heart. If you want to hear more stories of the untamed spirit of the frontier, of legends forged in fire, then subscribe to Wild West Stories. Like this video and share the legend.